to Coffee Talks. If you are logging in, when you log in, you can just put where you're logging in from in the chat and let us know what your favorite brew is. We all have our brew this morning. I know, Amy, we all have our brew this morning. We couldn't necessarily function without it. So just let us know what your favorite brew is, and we will get started in just a minute. I am Hannah Tejeda. I am the Director of Education for United for Growth Manufacturing, specifically NorvaNivel and Pedagogy Furniture. And we're going to get into it. We'll talk a little bit about format of today's session. We have two amazing special guests with us today, and we're going to have a great conversation. We will ask engaging questions along the way. So here we go. So every Coffee Talks episode will have three different components. Our espresso shot, usually we highlight literature that has inspired that session's conversation or the topic. We'll have pour over moments, which are more like polls or questions that you can pour over even after the session has ended. And then at the end, we'll have some cold brew moments, which include product recommendations, project highlights, anything that we want to emphasize from the industry. So with that, let's get into our topic for the day. So we are going to be talking about anxiety and choice. I hope nobody feels anxious talking about anxiety and choice, but we will talk about anxiety and choice just kind of from a human development perspective, and then we'll gradually kind of corral that to a design and educational perspective. So I'm really excited for how all of that will intersect and how that's related, and learn more how learning environments can support feelings like anxiety, because it is very real and it is very potent in both kids and adults in the learning spaces. Our espresso shot moment. These are three amazing pieces of literature that we've been diving deep into. We highly, highly recommend, please stop by Barnes & Noble and pick these guys up. But we have The Anxious Generation. It is an international hit by Jonathan Haidt. We have The Paradox of Choice, which I think this is actually the fourth or fifth rendition of this text by Barry Schwartz. And then Scientific American, my love, that's the nerd in me coming out. I will always grab a Scientific American, but this issue is all about diverse minds and specifically treating the anxious teenager. So we know it's very rampant in teens, but we're going to talk about all ages today. I'm super excited to announce our special guest. We have our UFG A&D liaison and regional rep, Adriana. Hey guys. And then we also have visiting us all the way from the tri-state area in New York, White Plains. We have children's pastor all the way. She has her coffee. Okay. We have children's pastor and PTA President, Amy Vandantham. Thank you so much, Amy, for joining.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So Amy, and Adriana, before we get into our first round of discussions, just take a second, tell us a little bit about yourself, your roles that you have, and kind of what you hope to get out of today's conversation. Amy, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. I'm Amy Vandantham. I am from White Plains, New York, not originally, and I serve as the children's pastor at Ridgeway Church in White Plains. And I have two girls, and one who is currently in the process of evaluation for ADHD and anxiety. So it's very much at the forefront, but we work with a lot of kids who are experiencing that. And that kind of got me involved in the PTA and landed me where I'm at right now. But just to be more involved in the educational experience of my children. And so some of the things that we see a lot are kids that are dysregulated. And so just keeping my kind of ear to the ground of what's happening, why, and always engaging in that question of like, how do we meet kids and families where they are? It's kind of the impetus for what I do and why I do it.
And it's so interesting, like we'll get into this in the conversation, but how like your role as children's pastor and PTA president / parent / spouse, like how all of those like are
Yeah.
so interrelated with the things that you experience.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I cannot wait to like dive into that a little bit more. Adriana, hello.
Hello.
Tell us, yeah, a little bit about your role and kind of what you hope to get out of our conversation.
Well, I'm Adriana Mezquitti. I know my name's a little
Gotcha.
long there, just so you guys know how to pronounce that. So yeah, I have a design background. I've been an I can hear myself.
I
I've
gotcha.
been an interior designer for the last decade. And I'm the new A&D rep and liaison for NorvaNivel. I was introduced to Norva, and as a person who is neurospicy, I ADHD and deal with anxiety myself. And I also have a teenage son with the same, neurodivergent situation as me, and was also diagnosed last year with autism. Um, NorvaNivel just spoke to me. What we do as a company for schools and for children, and I think the change and the vision of NorvaNivel and really just education in general, it just really spoke to me, and it hits close to home for me as a kid who didn't have it growing up, and watching my son not having the tools and the space and the environment to thrive as a neurodivergent child. Um, e- Everything that we do as a company, I think, is just so inspiring, and it really, I wouldn't jump in to sell something that I didn't believe in wholeheartedly, and that's what I'm promoting here and I'm doing here. But yeah, that's what I'm doing.
So it sounds like between the three of us, we could probably have like a 4-hour conversation about this topic.
It would be deep and it would be good.
It would be deep. It would be, listen, if you want another episode with the same guests on the same topic where we dive a little bit deeper, please drop it in the chat. Please let us know via email, let Caitlin know, but we would be happy to have a part 2.
Let's be neurospicy together.
Right. Okay, we are going to get into a couple of discussion questions. So, Amy, just to kick it off, you kind of highlighted what you see in your own, in your daughters,
Yep.
in terms of anxiety and what you experience, especially as a children's pastor. But what do you think are the primary causes of anxiety that you see, that you observe?
Aside for I can speak specifically about my youngest daughter, and I think that her big anxiety producer, she was exhibiting anxiety since probably, honestly, like since birth. And that is no joke. She was very sensitive to loud noises. And when, as a child, my family would joke because she would pinch her neck like this. And so she had a lot of like things that she did to ground herself, to soothe herself. So that was just something that she was showing. And the more that we reflect, we're like, wow, that's interesting. But I think what I see is there is this fear of not being in control. They want to know that what about their space and what's comfortable and what's known. And so, and also perfectionism. So like the things that kids have in their brain of what they want is not able to be produced either verbally or with their bodies, and that builds up frustration, and there's something that happens with them. They have a high expectation of themselves, and it doesn't make sense because it's like they've had that level of expectation for high expectation since birth. But I see when I come in on a Sunday morning and I see kids, it's a lot of the unknown, and are they comfortable in that space of new and different. So that's what I kind of see. It's like there's this expectation versus reality, and and then the expectation of their reality and it not meshing and lining up, I think is
Yeah.
something that I see a lot of.
Do you, Adriana, would you say, because your son is 17?
Yeah, he'll be
Oh
18
my
in a
goodness.
couple weeks.
Do you, did you notice, like, I don't want to say similar symptoms because the way that kids express their anxiety looks royally different, right? It's very individual, but at the same time, there's like those underlying precursors. Do you, looking back, especially around the time of like the beginning of the academic year and everything's kind of ramping up and new social situations, and Amy, kind of how you highlighted like new spaces, did you witness any?
Yeah, I knew I'd be learning a lot of things joining this webinar and just talking to both of you. But Amy, you just said something about your daughter's self-soothing by pinching her neck. And there's this thing my son did when he was a baby, and he did it up until he was maybe 2 to 3 years old. And I didn't realize until just this second, if my eyes just glazed over
Like,
like this,
wait.
I was like, oh. So my son used to do this thing where he had his blankie, his favorite blanket,
Yeah.
and he would rip pieces of the softness off of it, and then not eat it, but he would rip it out, and then he would put his bottle or his sippy cup as he got older in, and what he tore out, he put right at the edge of his nose and his sippy cup, and then grabbed the blanket and put it here. But so when you held the blanket up, there was patches that so I eventually, because I didn't want that blanket to just not exist suddenly, I had to buy multiples and I had them stocked up, because eventually there'd be no blanket,
Yeah.
there'd be just patches of it.
Yeah.
But he did this thing, and I always thought it was the funniest quirk, and I don't think that at that time in my life, being such a young parent, because I was 21, I don't think that I thought ever, oh, my son is self-soothing. I wasn't taught that, and I wasn't, I think it's such a stigma culturally to think about any neurodivergence. And it wasn't something that was talked about or
Yeah.
said when I was a child. It was just like, oh, she just can't pay attention. She's
Yeah.
just talks all the time and she fidgets. So I noticed things like that.
Yeah.
And he wasn't talking. We had to do speech therapy when he was 3, but he had these little things that I called quirks. And I am just now realizing he was self-soothing. He was trying to process. He was trying to
Yeah.
kind of cope with
Figure it out, basically.
figuring
Figure
things
it out.
out.
Yeah.
He did talk. He all of a sudden was talking all the time. And when he did
Yeah.
start to develop, it all really just happened really, really, really fast. He was walking at 10 months and he was doing all these things. And of course, the autism, he was never properly diagnosed, but it was me not understanding fully what autism meant and being explained like, hey, autism it's a problem with processing communication, right?
Yeah.
And all of his shutdowns whenever he was having issues with processing school, processing anxieties, processing fears, processing really anything, and he would just shut down and stop talking, and he wouldn't act out. There was no behavior issues, but I didn't even understand that.
Yeah.
And it started when he was very, very little. Like my son would just all of a sudden just
Stop.
I'm not talking to
Yeah.
anybody. I'm not moving. I'm not doing anything.
Well, and it's interesting because I'm hearing you describe it, and Amy, how you were describing, especially with family members, mentioning quirks or like traits or little characteristics, and that's kind of how we view it. I myself was diagnosed with something called trichotillomania when I was younger. So from, oh my gosh, I want to say that like kindergarten age up until even almost high school, like I was that kid. I didn't have any eyebrows. I didn't have any eyelashes. I didn't have, I would pull, my stem was pulling, and it was pulling everything. It was like unraveling rugs. It was like popping the plastic wrap pops, right? It was anything that I could dexterity wise with my
Feel.
hands, the feel, that's what I did. But but I'm so thankful, especially Amy, thinking about the girls and their ages that like, especially with your background, that they're able to go through, you know, like an assessment and an evaluation process, and that process has more foundational information today than what it
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know from like a pastoral perspective,
Mhm.
right? When people come into the church building and when you are mentoring and counseling with kids, what are some tactics that you use or strategies that you use in talking with them about anxiety, or when you see it, right? When you see it happening.
Yeah. I see it more. And I'm always hesitant, but I was talking to a teacher and she's like, your experience as a parent is informs and makes you a better pastor and makes you a better teacher. And so life experience and just my youngest is 8 and we've started she's but like when I have been on this journey with her as long as I've been a pastor. So she's been informing my practice in so many ways. And so what I realized with both of my girls is that I have to be their student. And so the more that I learn about
Mm.
them, the more that I learn how to parent them, the more I learn about their social emotional development, um, the better I would be as a pastor, as a mom, as in all facets. And so it
Mhm.
builds and increases the compassion and the identification of like, hey, one of the things that I tell my toddler parents that come in, I'm like, my goal is first and foremost that they feel safe. If they are, that's the threshold of it. So if it takes that child longer to transition, that's
Mhm.
okay. You're a part of helping that learning process. Um, I think that it helps me kind of walk in humility in that I am not the expert and I will pull people as much. And I value the input that others bring on identifying and I'm a sponge. So like I will absorb how if I see a teacher and how they talk to the student, role model that because it's like that is super helpful. Um so I do that, but when I see a child, it's a lot of grace and explaining to the parent in the best way that I can, like whatever that child needs is what we can give them. And I'm not perfect. There are kids that still trigger me. But being able to kind of step out and bracket my feelings in the situation and help them and say like this is what they need to get through this hour or 45 minutes or 3 hours depending on what the situation is and what we're doing. So this is what they need. So we've put in um, different tools and different environmental elements to our what we do on a Sunday morning, what we do for
Yeah.
our Bible camp, like putting in that for them. So I think it just your antennas go up more when you
Yeah.
see kids that are just need a different environment and give them
Mhm.
the grace and the space that they need um,
Yeah.
to learn.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm noticing a pattern in all the things that we're saying, right? Like behavioral science is a real thing. And when we are basing like our practice, whatever that is, right, in whatever industry, when we're basing our practice and our pedagogy off of behavioral science, the connectedness and the relatedness is a little bit more positive, and
Mhm.
you know the process at which we operate becomes a little bit more clear. So whether, you know, being a children's pastor and working in children's ministry, or myself, my background is special education, most often teaching in an ICT setting or self-contained setting, but you know,
Mhm.
behavioral science wasn't a part of my background in becoming an educator. It's a lot of curriculum, it's a lot of do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. um so at the beginning of the academic year, I was always a nervous wreck. I would love being around people meeting new people, but I didn't like crowds.
Oh yeah.
I
Mhm.
wanted to get to know my teacher, but I didn't want to talk in front of everyone,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
You want to participate in some activities, but you don't want to participate in others.
Mhm.
Um, so the way I felt walking into an environment massively impacted like my personal outcomes, like socially, emotionally, academically, how I felt about
Yeah.
myself, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm glad that we can have conversations like this. And in 2024,
Mhm.
whether it's of spiritual advisory, whether it's education, whether it's design, like behavioral science
Yeah.
it's becoming
I
more
love.
prevalent, yeah, in our conversations. So we're gonna move into the next part of our discussion. Um, from the anxious generation, it highlights a lot how we just have this fire hose of content always coming out with social media, with technology, but we're displacing a lot of in-person activity, physical activity, in-person communication. And the same topic is kind of highlighted throughout the paradox of choice, talking about freedom to choose, how that's our like
Mhm.
expressive value, our expressive freedom. Amy, I know you highlighted choice.
Mhm.
Adriana, I was thinking about like the quirks that you mentioned that your son would do with his blanket. And I'm envisioning that if anyone were to go and remove that, that would be exceedingly upsetting for him.
Oh, it absolutely was.
Yeah. So have you experienced that before? Has that happened before?
With him?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when he was little, I needed him to do something, right? Like we needed to
Mhm.
get out of the house. We needed to get him.
It's always getting out of the
Look,
house.
look, I needed
Transitions.
car seat. Okay. I needed to
Mhm.
get him, we needed to go inside of Old Navy. We needed to
Yeah.
get inside of the grocery store. Um, and it was getting him out of the car seat, and he's comfy cozy in his blanket and his little fuzzball on top of his sippy cup or on top of his bottle. And it was the moment that it was removed, because I'm trying to get him, out, and I can't just, pick him up and move him.
Mhm.
And so he was never the type of kid to throw these massive tantrums and fall on the ground and yell, but he'd cry. He would start
Yeah.
crying, and it was just devastating. And it was the pleading, the mama, and just the crocodile tears and
Yeah.
the heartbreak. And so there I am standing, waiting for him to be ready.
Yeah.
Um, and then I was like, okay, am I being like, am I soft parenting? Am I being tough? Which one's right?
Yeah.
Because I grew up with soft parenting. What is that? I didn't
Yeah.
grow up with that.
Oh no, it was the
Um,
taxi's leaving now, and if you're not ready, I'm leaving you
yeah. Oh,
behind.
oh, it would have been snatch the blanket, kid. Get yourself out of the car
Yeah.
seat. No, it was so I'm standing there waiting for him to, which back then, again, I did not know he was
Mhm.
soothing. I did not know he
Right.
was processing. To me, it's just that I just felt like this is heartbreaking for me. I don't want to force this thing. And then it would obviously hit me, because I am a young parent. I'd be like, okay, I'm snatching the blanket and like, come on, kid, we gotta go. And I'm having to pick him up, and it's the middle of summer in Texas, and I've got a blanket on
Oh,
us. And then he's just doing it now in a buggy, in a
right.
cart, right? Like
Yeah.
he's redoing the process.
But it seems to be like the removal of having that option is the trigger, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
the not being able to have that choice of I need to do this and I need to do it now. And if there's like a barrier to that,
Yeah.
Amy, I know that you mentioned choice, right? Choice and fear when it comes to anxiety. I'm curious to know at the beginning of the academic year, going through the evaluation process, what role do you think choice plays thinking about the anxiety that goes into like kids going back to
Mhm.
school?
Oh my goodness.
I know that's like a
So it's
loaded question.
I was like, I'm trying to remember like
Where do we
um
start?
where do we start? So my youngest, it was a lot of preparing her, and it was weird because she was going to school right right as we were coming, like right when schools were reopening for COVID, like during COVID. So it was such a weird time to
Such a
begin
tough
with.
time for kids.
Yeah. And but the funny thing is that when she was 3 when we all kind of shut down, and she was pretty much nonverbal in um in in her threes program. But
Okay.
she spent the time that she spent with her sister, and she had teletherapy for speech OT and a CIT. So she had all of these people like pouring into her during um over like yeah. So when she came out of that into the fours program, she was like so talkative and sharing and difficulty with transitions. So it was in that transition moment, and I was aware of it, that we were talking and processing it through and bringing her along, because her sister's older, through all of that process. So she's familiar with her space as best as possible. And so just talking her through that was really helpful. And yeah, that was the big thing, but giving her that space um to articulate. So it's not so much that we had
Yeah.
choice, but she was able to talk about what was going on in her environment, and giving her that space. And I think space and choice are kind of similar in that
Mhm.
they're in control, and there's not that they're in complete control because it's guided. There are
Right.
limitations to that, but they have a sense of ownership in what's happening. Um, and I would get a lot of, and she still struggles with transition, even in third grade. So it comes down to, do I have ownership of the transitions that happen in school? And that's
Yeah.
where we saw lots of the breakdown. And she needed, and continues to need, visual reminders of what's happening. What do I need to do? What's on my to-do list? So
Yeah.
she has control and ownership of what's happening. So I think is also really important. So like choice, yes, give her, yeah, like we can always do the, would you like to take this?
Right.
But also giving her ownership of the space is really, really important too. So
And in talking about like being the owner of your space, like that is a level of autonomy that even teachers sometimes don't have. So it's like
yeah.
it's really hard to be able to integrate that into your learning culture when you yourself as an educator don't necessarily sometimes have a lot of autonomy to have that space or make those decisions on your own, right?
Yeah.
Being communicated what curriculums to use, your schedule of the day, literally having to call the front office to use the bathroom, and like not being able to take a deep breath. Elementary school teachers, like you have your same kids all day long. I taught middle school for a stint, and at least in middle school when they transitioned, like one class would leave and one class would come out, so I could like stand in the corner and scream at the wall for a second and then like come back.
Yeah.
But as a kid going through those, like that's me as an adult, right? That's teachers
Yeah.
as an adult, educators as an adult. But as a kid, for crying out loud, both of your brain's hemispheres aren't fully firing until you're 8 or 9. So then when you're
Yeah.
talking about even before that, not having the ability to communicate, even if someone does give you space, right? Not having the ability to
Mhm.
communicate, this is why I feel this and
Yeah.
how and when it happens.
Yeah.
So we're gonna turn anxiety, our conversation on anxiety, and experiences to the physical environment. But before we do, we have our first pour over moment. So this is a question for us to answer now, but this is also a question for us and everybody attending to continue pouring over for the rest of your time when you go into teaching, when you're working on projects, when you're working with kids, maybe if you're a parent, when you go home and you interact with your kids. But the first pour over moment question is, everybody do a drum roll on your coffee mug. So our first pour over moment is, what emotion is normally related to anxiety? So what emotion is at the forefront anxiety? Is it joy? Is it excitement? Is it nervousness? Is it fear? Whatever you think, we're going to give you a moment to answer. So go ahead and pop your thoughts either in the chat. Think about it a little bit. I feel like I have mixed answers, but the three of us know the answer to this question already.
I mean, I know the answer because I know what I feel when I get anxiety.
Yeah, I know the answer. 12 years of like starting in the classroom right before all of my kids come in on the first day of school. You're sitting there like, okay. Or like, I know, Amy, like before we get like the influx of kids coming in like on a Sunday morning, you're like, okay. So everybody ready? Should we all say it on three together? So the emotion most commonly related to anxiety is fear. And I know, Amy, you talked a little bit about it, but just that constant fear of not having control, fear of not being understood, fear of what I'm doing looks weird and stupid right now, the fear of messing up in front of people, just like any type of fear, fear of fear, any type of fear that you literally can think of. And so now we're going to get into what does that actually, look like in like the physical environment, and how actually our physical environment can be a support for things like anxiety. So pour over moment. I hope everybody was able to consider fear. All right, here we go. I'm gonna stop sharing.
And I consider fear all the time.
I'm over you. I'm fearful right now of the presentation. Just kidding. All right, so we're going to look at a quote via Scientific American, and this is why I love this source, guys. Okay, so talking about fear, a core emotion associated with anxiety is fear, but not just fear in a given moment, but persistent fear after an elongated time. We can get to a pathological state of anxiety, meaning we're stuck in that fight or flight mode for longer, and it takes a lot more momentum to get us out. And I know I mentioned before, kids before a certain age, are working with basically one side of their brain. The other side isn't necessarily turned on, greased up, and fired on all cylinders yet. And so when we experience that fear, we literally lose some of our cognitive functioning control, which allows us to do things like transition well, or have conversations, or explain our emotional state, or even be aware. And there's a handful of things that we can do in our physical space that support that. So our next segment of discussion, how can we connect what we just talked about in terms of development or psychological observation and learning space design. So I'm super excited because having the design background and having the spiritual advisory background, Amy, I know that there are a handful of things that you specifically have in place in your physical environment to assist with anxiety and assist with fear. And I'd love for you to walk us through, like, what does your office look like? And what are some of those environmental factors that you've implemented, like in your office space?
Yes, I just recently transitioned into my current space, and the big joke was that it looked like a studio apartment because I have like my desk space, but then I have like a whole living space. And I was gifted a huge dollhouse, and that is in the corner. But I also was gifted a weighted blanket, and both of those have proven very helpful. But I do keep toys out for kids to use to play and to connect with. And so like this Sunday is a great example. I had a kid who need it. He was just really dysregulated. And his mom was walking with him in the halls. And I said, you can go to my office and you can play. And so I'll see that there'll be toys and whether that's like fidgets or puzzles that they can manipulate, a dollhouse. So there's lots of different things, coloring books, lots of coloring, things that can kind of like calm them down, or just envelop them if they need to. So
Yeah.
providing them that space to calm down, that's calm, serene, isn't overly it's not overly stimulating as well. So it's just really allows them to take that deep breath that they need to like get their amygdala back in order. So yeah, that's and it's purposeful. So my colleagues laugh and they think it's funny that I have a dollhouse, but I'm like, it
Listen.
makes a big difference.
You might need to come in one day and use that dollhouse, my friend.
And they have.
Well, and even in just highlighting, right? I mean, and your office is inside a church, and there's a large number of different types of individuals that come through the space, right? But even thinking about that in comparison to an academic setting, it's not that much different. You have a large population coming through the building of all physical and cognitive capabilities, but even the terminology that you use, you're highlighting a lot of the strategies that educators are using within their space, right? Having a calming, serene space within a classroom or within a corridor or a hallway, having manipulatives for them to play and fidget, sensory items for them to feel, with their sensory receptors on and firing. And then you also mentioned like having a serene space. So we know that behavioral science is highly connected to things like color psychology, things like texture, things like almost like feng shui. Like there is a cognitive response to our physical environment that directly impacts our behavior. So we've kind of already, in a way, established some critical design criteria, right? When we're considering learning spaces, we mentioned a few. I'm curious, Adriana, from like a design perspective and a lot of the projects that you've worked on, how often are you considering this criteria? And when the criteria is followed, how successful do you see these environments?
I mean, so color theory is going to be productive in every space. So whether you're talking about a restaurant or you're talking about someone's home or you're talking about a spa, and very specifically a school, because we're raising learners, right? Color theory is going to be extremely important. If you put red in a space, it promotes people wanting to stay longer, and it also promotes hunger. If you put surgeons wear green, because it does not promote hunger, right? You don't want people to be hungry before they're going to surgery.
When they're in an operating room.
Correct. Doctors and nurses wear blue because it's calming. And spas, usually when you think about spa colors, you think about very light, muted, soft tones of greens and blues and off-whites, nothing stark, right? And when you talk about wood tones, you talk about light, natural wood tones, nothing that's going to be aggressive on the eye.
Yeah.
And biophilia is so important, bringing in green, bringing in the outside, and what that does to the brain, how that triggers something in us. It's something innate, just being in nature. So having plants in a space, it just makes people feel better, makes people happy. Incorporating that in any space, no matter what that space is being used as, is going to be helpful for people and our well-being in general. When you incorporate that into an educational space, and for children, especially children that have needs and have sensory issues, but obviously we're thinking about kids in general. All kids need, regardless of them having neurodivergent, and sensory brains, just all kids in general. We want them to have calming and and spaces where they can
Mhm.
learn without there being just too much chaos, right?
Right.
So incorporating color and wood tones and accessories
Yeah.
and furniture
Yeah.
and bringing the outside in for them, it makes a huge difference. It not only triggers different things in their
Yeah.
brains, it also, you know, they can focus on learning and they can focus on the subjects when their surroundings aren't taking away
Right.
some of that brain power.
Yeah.
So, I mean, design is extremely important, no matter the space. Everything is planned right. Like interior design is very important because there's a there's a reason our job exists.
Yeah.
But definitely in education, I um, thinking about how you're planning a space and for who you're planning the space. It is very important.
Well, and tying it back to like the behavioral part that we all three of us are talking about, right? And Amy, you mentioned like you are the learner in watching and observing the individuals that you're serving and the individuals that you're working with. Like if I understand what does a trigger look like for you, or what is your stim, or what sets you off, what you gravitate towards, whether it's a specific texture like the blanket, whether it's a specific temperature. Like I know there's tons of schools, especially across the United States, that I don't know, this is not based in research at all, but any school that you go into during like state assessment or standardized testament time, they literally blast the air conditioner so that like we're gonna stay awake
It
and
keeps the
we're
kids
gonna
awake, yeah.
it keeps us awake and Amy, I see your face.
Listen,
What are
I'm
you
like,
thinking?
I'm not-
Yeah, what are you
I'm
thinking?
going to
It's
sleep.
so funny. Yeah. Temperature is it's so important to me, that, I am not creative in cold temperatures. So I'm not gonna think well when it's
Yeah.
really cold. And I think that that's an irony that they have it. I understand they want you to be awake and alert. But your body is trying to function and stay warm, that you actually all of the energy it is taking to recall information. It's like you're fighting against each other.
Yes. Well, and we talk about temperature as in like an air conditioning unit, but temperature also in all of the different mediums that you're using throughout the space. If you have a metal chair and a metal desk and a tile floor and metal around door frames, like that is all technically of a certain temperature, right? Or like if everything's cold, everything that I'm sitting on is cold. All my work surfaces are cold. Everything is cold. So having variances of things like texture and temperature, especially I think of my stems when I was younger and like picking and pulling and writing. Like I constantly got in trouble for writing on desks, and I constantly got in trouble for whatever was laminated. I was that kid that like would pull up the side and like pick at the side. So not just like positioning in a layout, but color theory, texture, temperature, choice, right? All of that is supportive of alleviating anxiety, specifically in a learning space, but honestly, in all spaces, realistically.
Well, all of those cold hard services feel so institutional and sound so
They
institutional.
sound so
They don't
institutional. Yeah.
sound calming. They don't feel calming, and they're not going to promote any of those feelings that we want kids to have.
No.
They will literally promote anxiety
Yeah.
and cause more fidgeting and less attention
Yep.
because the kids, I mean, we wouldn't be comfortable. I mean,
all of our executive functioning is altered when it comes to anxiety. So we're going to go ahead and enter into a cold brew moment. And our cold brew moment, if you guys remember, is where we have specific recommendations in terms of pieces, in terms of projects that we have that assist with alleviating anxiety and specific stressors. So one of our first recommendations, and we would recommend this for at home, in an office environment, in an administrative environment, environment in a classroom setting. You know, we cater primarily to educational settings, but pieces like this work in so many different, where humans exist. This is where we recommend these pieces because
Guys,
they're
no joke. Look.
behavioral science oriented. So we have, this is our rockerot. And as you can see, there is a slight 10-degree angle on this piece, which is actually wonderful for lower lumbar support. Any person that asks you to sit up straight, I would kindly advise you to tell them that that's not physically possible. Nobody, and I think Amy, like you can attest to like how many kids that you see on a weekly basis, and this is hundreds of kids, guys. This is not just like, Amy doesn't just work with maybe like 15 kids at a time. It's like 150 kids a day. Amy, do kids sit up straight?
No.
Yeah,
a lot of that, whatever's comfortable. So yeah, I mean, I try not to have them lay on the floor, but sometimes that's what they need to do. So.
Sometimes that's what's necessary. So, and when you integrate a piece like this into a space, like, listen, Adriana,
I have not stopped moving the entire time, and it's this.
They can move, they can sit on, they can be perched on their knees, they can also alter the piece so that there is no movement, because sometimes movement helps, right? If we need like a gas station because we need to get revved up, but sometimes we need a rest stop. Sometimes we don't need any movement, and that's actually overstimulating. And so there is a straight side to this piece that you can alter the piece and maneuver it in a way where you have movement, you don't have movement. It's all foam, and it's a healthcare grade vinyl. So, I mean, Amy, I know you've seen it all, and we've seen it in educational spaces, and especially in design of products, like physical reactions in a space, like sneezing and coughing and sweating and like all of these things, especially around kids. Groups of kids are like petri dishes when it comes to we made the same face, our bodily functions. And so having something like a healthcare grade vinyl is beautiful in a space.